Welcome to the Finding the Magic podcast, where books come alive. I'm Tricia Copeland, a fiction author and host of this show. If you love books, finding great reads, and hearing about the story behind the story directly from the authors, this is the place for you. Whether you like fantasy, science fiction, dystopian, or romance titles, I think you'll find something to love in my playlist. Listen in to discover something magical about a book or two today. Welcome, Sebastien.
Hi, Tricia. Thanks for having me.
Oh, thanks for being on. I feel like I'm having an old friend back to tea.
Thanks. Yeah. It's been a little while since we last talked, but I think you were saying that the episode from when we last talked probably came out in November. So
Right, so about 9 months ago. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
And fortunately, I don't know, sometimes I record a long time in advance, but fortunately, this episode will come out next week. So we don't have too long to wait. We can talk about current events. Your latest release is Malevolent 8, right?
That's right. Yeah, Malevolent Eight. It's the sequel to Malevolent Seven, which is a book you and I talked about last time when I was saying how it was this book that I had never planned to publish. I'd written it just for me, and then through a bunch of strange circumstances, mostly literary agent related, it ended up becoming this hit fantasy novel that I was just not expecting. So now Malevolent Eight has just come out, and in fact, I'm going to be working on Malevolent Nine very soon.
Fine. Well, I read a little bit of about the blurb for Malevolent 8, but tell everyone what it's about. I'm seeing a huge good versus evil here.
Well, it's funny because it follows on from Malevolent Seven, of course, which is about a guy named Cade Ombra, who's a what's called a wondrist, a kind of a mercenary mage, and he's someone who had tried being a good guy in his younger days, failed at that tremendously, partly because it turned out the people he was working for weren't the good guys that he thought that they were. And then he became basically what's called an infernalist, a kind of a mercenary magician who gets spells by making deals with these beings from an infernal realm, who then ends up embroiled in this kind of world-threatening crisis, along with six other completely emotionally damaged mercenary mages who vary from, a thunderer whose solution to every problem either involves blowing it up with lightning or dropping his trousers. An idealistic young woman who happens to be a blood mage, so accidentally exsanguinates people periodically. The most handsome, dashing, swashbuckling mage of all, who happens to be a rat mage. And so all of these kind of emotionally damaged characters sort of come together in that book. And then in Malevolent Eight, what happens is that this very long foretold, as you say, kind of good versus evil, or ostensibly good versus evil clash is about to finally happen. So the forces of the auroral realm and the infernal realm, who've had both had this notion of a great crusade for millennia and have never had a place where they could actually fight their war, have finally found a way to fight their war. It happens to be on the mortal plane. And so Cade and his band of misfits are determined to stop the war by any means necessary, but since they're not pacifists, their solution is mostly to kill as many people as they have to bring peace about, which goes about as well as you can imagine. Oh, and also there's a vampire kangaroo. So you're welcome, universe.
Fine. So mages are like witches. Is that a correct comparison?
Yeah, the tagline on Malevolent Seven used to read, "Think you know wizards, think again," and it was really because the original impetus of that book, I think, was I had just read one too many sort of pseudo Gandalf characters, right? The kind of wizened old person, with a frail physical body who's commanding all these, supernatural forces, and I was always like, that wouldn't work. You need to be physically pretty strong, and actually, the people who wielded this kind of power probably wouldn't be all that wise. They would probably be kind of emotionally and mentally, challenged from wielding those forces. And so I was really trying to write about these guys, and I used the term wondrist for them because I wanted there to just be a kind of a term that I thought within that world, that's what people would call them, like these kind of, because they're not it's, we sometimes, because of the way fantasy has become a little bit sort of regimented, almost like it always tries to establish a bunch of Dungeons and Dragons like rules for its magic, that you end up with a scenario where it almost feels like, mages are just like, they're like soldiers or plumbers or cell phone technicians. It's just very, but I think in this world, as far as other people are concerned, they're just like these bizarre kind of miracle workers, and so they get referred to as wonderists. And there's all these different forms of wonderism, and the source of the magic in the universe of Malevolent Seven is this notion that certain people are attuned to a different plane of reality, and each of those planes of reality has its own physical laws. And so, when casting a spell is basically when you make a tiny breach in the fabric of reality, and so the laws of physics of that realm temporarily leak through. So, for example, in our world, you can't just summon thunder out of nowhere and hurl it at people. Whereas there is a tempostoral plane where that happens all the time, and so a tempostoral mage is one who can temporarily breach the walls between those realities, and so that's where that power is coming from. Or a totemist, someone who can take on certain attributes of animal spirits, um, creates a breach between our their plane of reality and one where animals exist as a kind of symbolic magical representation. And so I like that because it allowed me to create all these different sort of, I wanted to have 12 different magic systems in Malevolent Seven. Um, and it allowed me to do things like have it be that everybody hates luminists. Luminists are like the ones who can kind of manipulate light and create illusions. But as far as every other type of wondrous is concerned, they're sort of like the most gaudy losers out there. So there's a lot of sort of irreverence throughout.
Well, that wondrous term is perfect then, because it's like they wonder what could happen if, and then it happens, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah. And usually it all goes very, very badly, which is part of, which is part of the fun. I used to characterize it, so many fantasy authors, I mean, so many of us all at some point in our careers want to write the Magnificent Seven, but with magic. And so I had wanted to write sort of the Magnificent Seven, but with wizards who go around blowing things up and swearing constantly. And I really did not expect that to be a hit.
Interesting. Yeah, because I think it sounds like you're getting Guardians of the Galaxy feel too here, right? I mean, is it a contemporary feel or is it more medieval? Who or what technology do these people have?
Yeah, so one of the things I always tend to posit in when I write fantasy that has a lot of magic in it is that if we had magic that would actually slow our progress, both in terms of technologically, but also in terms of societies, like having sort of power that can be used so easily prevents societies from actually evolving to figure out all the really hard things that our human societies had to do to develop all the amazing things that form part of our lives today. And so, but I've never liked talking or writing in the sort of what I used to call the these and thous, where dost thou goest, and so I prefer to write in a more what we could say contemporary voice. But that world is kind of a very messed up world, and so it's not clear in some ways what what level of technology they should be at because of the effects of these wonders. And also, anytime you the primary role of a wondrist in the world of Malevolent Seven is they get hired by warlords of various types. So someone decides I want to be the new prince of whatever. They get their army together, but they also hire these mercenary mages, which means that when they come up to the castle, the fortress or whatever, it's these mages who blow it up. Um, which makes it very, very difficult to build things that last. And one of the sort of themes that fascinates me about our world uh, is how dependent we are on allowing things that were started by others to continue and to be finished. So, for example, and this is a slightly political thing to say, but I'll try not to get lost in polemics. um, there has always been a tradition in Western democracies where whatever the previous government did, they did. They were elected and they did it. You might not like it, but within reason, you kind of have to let it stand. There's actually nothing that stops a new government from coming in. And literally, the first thing they do is vote out every single thing the previous government did. But when you do that, things like international treaties fall apart. Things like almost every major infrastructure on the planet takes more than 4 years, for example. So, like in the U.S., you have 4 year, for presidents and 2 years, I think, for Congress and 6 years for senators. In Canada, here we generally have like a 5 year election for our members of parliament. And so, if they choose to basically, to use Malevolent Seven terminology, blow up whatever the previous ones did, you really can't advance at all.
Yeah, it would take so long to get anybody to come to a conclusion about what should be different or how it should be different that nothing would ever happen.
Yeah, and so that's part of the fun, and that's one of the reasons why the world that they're in has kind of all of these problems. And actually, the medieval world in European history, that was one of its problems, was that, especially in the early Middle Ages, which used to get called the Dark Ages, which was never really a very scientific sort of term, but the constant back and forth of different warlords and different barons and things like that meant that it was just very hard to build anything that lasted. And we as human beings, although we constantly feel that we have all this agency, like we're living our lives, we're living in this present. We're not. We're living in this continuum from the past in which, our lives are going to constitute a tiny slice of all of these incredible developments that they needed us to be part of it, but we're not sufficient. Like one generation isn't sufficient to do all of these amazing things. So it's yeah. So in a world where you can hire war mages to go blow up the enemy, fortress or dams or whatever else, it's very hard to kind of advance.
Yeah, I would, and that makes sense. But I'd never thought of the fact that if you have magic, you don't need like advanced medicine or you don't
Mhm.
need telephones or computers because if you could like, transfer your ideas via just brain waves or that magical, however that works, then yeah, you don't need all of those things. So I never
There
thought
was
about it that way.
There's a famous designer named Philippe Starck. He's famous for designing things like toilets and toothbrushes and mega yachts. And he once criticized the whole world of TED Talks. Um, because if you've ever watched TED Talks, you're like, oh my God, that's an incredible idea. What an amazing development. The running theme of TED Talks is we can solve every single problem with technology. Like it's just waiting for someone from Silicon Valley to solve it, right? And so whatever it is, clean water, oh no, somebody came up with a little portable water bottle that you shake it and it'll get rid of all of the bacteria, or power, oh, we figured out this. But if we've had TED Talks for long enough that you could reasonably ask the question, well, then how come almost none of these things are actually being fixed? And it's because almost every problem requires human societies to fix them. It's not always just a technology problem. And so the Silicon Valley myth, which is mostly perpetuated by Silicon Valley billionaires, is just get out of our way. We'll invent something that'll fix whatever your problem is. And there's no better example, although, again, I'm not, without taking a position on climate change, other than that it's probably real. Um, the hard solution for climate change is that we all change how we live. That's a very difficult but societal solution. The simple one is some tech billionaire will build a giant rocket that will fly up to the atmosphere and then, clean out all the carbon or do whatever else is necessary. And we keep waiting for that. If you want, when people are wondering, like, we keep hearing all these scientific reports, things are getting worse. We see all of the effects of it starting to happen now. Why aren't we fixing it? Because everybody's secretly kind of waiting for that to happen. And if you lived in a society where you had magic, something that, snap of a fingers, a snap of someone's fingers does the work of, I don't know, 10,000 people working for a year or whatever it is, you would never invent anything. You would always go, well, there must be a magic solution for this. And in our world today, we always just go, well, there must be a technology solution right around the corner. Apple's going to make something that'll solve this.
I just had this, it just popped into my brain. I had the solution for clean air. If you had enough drones with little filters in them flying around all the time, then the air could be cleaned. I mean, with carbon filters or, whatever kind of the kind in your fish tank or the ones you have like in your house. So
Yeah, there's certain scale problems. My
yeah,
favorite my
maybe
favorite scale
so.
pro My favorite scale problem, of course, is things like, AI, which, we don't have AI. We have large language models right now, for the most part. And even those consume unbelievable amounts of water. Like that's
Oh.
like you can because they consume massive amounts of power and they use massive amounts of cooling, like at a scale that apparently when people type please and thank you when they're using Chat GPT, that just the number of people doing that and the processing that it takes because it's now taking that please and thank you, apparently it just costs millions of dollars to OpenAI every year.
Oh, that's crazy.
Yeah, we it's scale is always the problem for human beings. We're innately not good at it, which is what makes fantasy sometimes when you bring those problems of scale back in, can be kind of really fun. When you can't solve the problem with a magic sword, uh, and in fact the problem is that everyone thinks a magic sword is the solution. You can get to a lot of really interesting drama.
Yeah, and well, and to circle back to your book, so the other question I had, so these two deities are trying to come together in this battle on the mortal plane. And so I mean I can think of a few different ways, like you prevent them from being able to come in, right? But can these deities even be destroyed? Can one of them be destroyed? I mean, is that possible in your world?
Well, that's certainly something that Cade and the Malevolent Seven would love if there was a way to do that. The problem that they face is so remember I mentioned the magic systems are based on drawing power from these other planes of reality. And two of those planes are the auroral plane, which kind of conforms to, on an appearance level, what we think of as almost heavenly. Like they have these servants called angelics, and they seem like, and the rulers are called the Lord Celestine, and they talk about benevolence and virtue, whereas the infernals, have horns, and they kind of they're they look like what we would think of as evil, but in fact what it is that the Lord Celestine are driven by the notion of imposing their one notion of virtue on everyone, and the infernals are obsessed by the notion of experience. If you should experience everything, you should experience every flavor, every emotion. You should do the most wonderful things, but the most perverse things. You should, and so it's because what I liked about that is that it makes them good and evil are very human concepts, but those types of extremes, the extreme of imposing order and the extreme of people should pursue all experiences, are very inhuman. It's very unnatural for us. And so that's kind of what they're facing, is these two forces that aren't really good versus evil. As Cade would put it, it's just, one kind of jerk against another kind of jerk. It's like the jerk that ratted everybody out in high school versus the jerk that got everyone into trouble in high school. And you're just like, if only we could get them to both go away, we'd be all right. And so over the course of the book, they're trying to find any way they can, to prevent them from doing it. Because the problem with war, of course, is that war is a type of industry. And once it becomes profitable, it's very, very hard to stop. And so the fear that they have is that because we're in the very early stages of this war at the beginning of Malevolent Eight, is that towns, one after another, are being recruited either to the auroral side or the infernal side. And so Cade's sort of notion of how to stop this is to make it very, very unprofitable to join one side or the other, because his fear is that generations of human beings are just going to be funneled into, these wars. If you think about it, the war in Ukraine, for example, there are kids who were 13 years old or 14 years old when the war started, Russian kids who are going to end up being drafted for this war at some point. And nobody thought that war was going to last more than 3 weeks at the time. And this thing could go on for a long time. And that the cost of doing that is that you start to lose generations, right? So
I
for
was gonna say,
example,
yeah, all these generations are just frozen. I mean, it's like COVID times, however many years, right? That we had that, like, just you didn't remember what happened before and you weren't sure what was gonna happen next, right?
Well,
So,
and think of the long-term effects we've had from COVID, just from a purely sort of, I mean, again, no, not my area of expertise, so I'll try to restrict myself from pontificating too much, but certainly, like kids, who couldn't be at school, for example, um, the weird traumas that has created, and that was a relatively short span of time, right? That we couldn't do anything. Um, and so already we're seeing, here in Canada, we see this sometimes. We're seeing the effects on people who from social isolation for what was functionally not that long a period. Now you start to apply that to a war, or if you think of a war like in Europe, the 30 Years' War in Europe, or the 100 Years' War, you're losing generations, and recovering from that can be quite difficult. Which fortunately, this being an irreverent dark fantasy novel, I get to do more of the explosions and less of the long-term psychological trauma of warfare.
well, that's good. We don't
Yeah.
want it to get too heavy there.
Yeah, no kidding.
So what comes next? Well, we obviously don't want to give away how Malevolent 8 ends, but what comes next in Malevolent 9? Is that an upcoming novel?
Yeah, so I'm starting Malevolent 9 very soon, and that one comes out next year. And that will be the completion of it. I have always known, I don't know why, because originally, as we discussed last time I was on the show, um, Malevolent Seven was a novel I just wrote for myself. It was February of 2020. COVID was happening. I had just finished delivering the sixth in a six-book young adult series where I was delivering two books a year, and every time the books were coming back, the language was becoming more and more policed. Even though I had a wonderful copy editor, and there was nothing wrong with what they were doing, but language was changing so fast. Words that were okay 6 months before were no longer okay, and I was just going nuts. And I went, screw it, I'm going to write whatever I want because no one else is going to have to read it. I wrote this incredibly violent, irreverent, foul-mouthed novel called Malevolent Seven, which again no one was supposed to read. And then my agent asked to read it, and then demanded that the chance to sell it. And I said, no one's going to buy this. And it was the fastest book sale I've ever made.
Wow.
And because it turned out that I wasn't really, we often feel, I think especially as writers, but I think actually everybody, I think lots of your listeners probably feel this way too, as if we have to be on guard for what we say, as if, you say the wrong thing and you're going to get canceled and things like that. And I certainly was starting to feel that way, even though I'd been fortunate that no one had ever tried to or wanted to cancel me for anything. Um, but when I was writing, so was writing this book going, I'm going to make all the nasty jokes I want to make. And I discovered that actually, if you're not actively trying to hurt somebody, or some group, you're probably not going to run afoul of anybody. And like people don't mind a dirty joke. They just don't want a dirty joke that's very pointedly meant to harm some group of people who are already probably being harmed in other ways. And so it was, I'd written this novel, and then it was meant, we were publishing it kind of as a standalone. You probably experienced this. There was a time like 10 years ago, if you got a book deal as a fantasy novelist, it was always going to be like 4 books or 3 books, right? It was three, for a while it was 3 books, then it was 4 books because they wanted the consistency. And now we're in an era where nobody wants to take those risks. So they always want to publish what's called standalone with series potential. They basically want you to give them a novel that they can just sell on the market as a standalone novel because readers are tired of, we've invested all this time and several years into a big fantasy series. Won't say anyone's name except for George R. R. Martin. And then they're waiting for this book, and the book's not coming out. And I think George R. R. Martin, by the way, is 100% right in that he can't give people a book that's not ready, and he can't control whether it's ready or not. Like it's not his place to compromise or sacrifice his artistic integrity, the very thing that made readers love him so much. It's tragic that for people that book can't come out, but it's not but beating him up over it doesn't make any sense. It's going to be what it is, and that's unfortunate. But as a result, a lot of publishers now are like, well, we want to publish a standalone, but we want that quote series potential. So if it takes off, and that's exactly what happened with Malevolent Seven. It took off. It was a very big book for me around the world, and so they said, do you have an idea for sequels? And I said, I've always known exactly how book two would start and exactly how book three would end, and nothing in the middle. Um, and so it's strange because that meant that Malevolent Eight, I was starting from, I know exactly what the opening scene is. I wrote the opening scene as a kind of a movie treatment for them when they asked me for a proposal. And as with the book, it was full of swearing and foul mouth references to the publishers themselves, as a bad joke. Um, and then so I had to write sort of forward from there. And now with Malevolent Nine, the one thing I know is exactly how it ends. And so now I'm writing towards an ending. So it's a very strange experience. I mean, that's what I love about the Malevolent books. It's fortunate for me that they are so irreverent and full of that sort of dark humor and the kind of the wildness of the magic and of these characters that have these very kind of emotionally compromised natures, because it suits where I am as a novelist when I'm writing them.
Yeah, I mean, feel like you can do that in fantasy novels. Like you can be irreverent in fantasy novels because they're all fantastical people. They don't really represent different groups of people in the real world, right? And sometimes it's very freeing, as it seems to be for you writing it. It's very freeing to read that. It's almost like a guilty pleasure and just like letting ourselves be like our stream of consciousness that we are always filtering at every minute when we're talking. I mean, and especially coming off writing a young adult series where you had to be so, paying attention to every, connotation and
Hmm.
inferral, or that's not the right word, but yeah. And so like I'm watching, I never thought I would, The Hunting Wives. Have you heard of this?
No.
So it's on Netflix, but I saw an advertisement. They kept asking me to watch it because they thought I would like to watch it. And I was like, no, I'm not going to watch this. I don't want to watch a bunch of wives sitting around drinking. I can do that with my friends. Um, and then my husband was like, no, this is everywhere. We have to try it. And it's this like set in Texas. These women like carry guns in their purses and they go out hunting on their like girls' trips. And it's just like so left field that you're like, oh my gosh, this is so fun. So yeah, I think,
Well, it's funny you say that because you're absolutely right. The freeing part of fantasy is you get to decide the rules, because fundamentally what you're doing, what makes something a fantasy novel, the most integral element really is some form of magic, right? Because if you literally just write a different world, but everything, but there's no magic whatsoever, then you're kind of tending to write sort of an alternate history, or it would be it's a strange sort of book. It tends to be more an allegory at that point. And we see some of those, great literary allegories out there that in some ways could be seen as fantasy or science fiction. But typically, a fantasy novel means you get to set the rules, the laws of physics of this world, right? And the societies. The problem is you then have to be consistent with those rules. We can all imagine a character who never uses the word the. Like that's not very complicated. You can do that. There could be a person, but once you're trying to write that character and you're like, they never use the word the, I have to find ways around this. I'm writing a progression fantasy now, which is a type of, it's a new series that was commissioned for me last year from these lovely guys called Athon Press, Athon Books. And because the character is dealing with these cultures from other sort of realms a little bit within that series, very different from Malevolent Seven, but there's still that sort of element of these other characters from other realms. Um, one of those cultures tends to never use direct pronouns. They tend to use impersonal pronouns. So every time they're talking, it's almost as if they're like repeating something someone else said. So they never say like, you better not go in there or you'll get killed. They say, well, one would be wise not to enter a place like that. And there's this, and they don't really look at you when they're talking to you for the most part. Like they see eye contact as overly intimate. Um, which is something that actually there's lots of people in our world who are uncomfortable with direct eye contact, and so it's kind of interesting to me to be writing that and going, God, that must be really difficult if you're going, but trying to stay consistent with that every time someone from that realm is talking to Caleb, the main character, and having to go, okay, how do I have to make sure this is framed impersonally, but it has to be parsable by the reader. Because literally there's times where Caleb has to translate for us. So he's like, it's even though it's written in English, like it's a, someone says this thing, but it's so convoluted and hypothetical that he has to go internally in his own mind for us, translation, you walk in that door, you're on your own.
Yeah, because I mean, saying one might be
Yeah,
harmed
yeah,
entering this space
yeah.
makes it sound much less dangerous than saying, don't go in there. You shouldn't go in
No,
there. Doesn't
exactly.
as
And there's so
immediate.
many ways. Oh, sorry, yeah. There's so many ways of using that kind of indirect speech, like, what but awe and gratitude could any visitor feel upon entry into such a grand place? Like rather than saying, look how amazing this is, right? It's just always that weird indirectness. And so you have to sort of follow those rules, whatever you make them. If you have, if you have magic, if you have magic swords, if you have whatever else, you get the freedom to set the rules, but you have to follow them, and that can make fantasy very challenging. Because I notice this all the time. If I'm reading a fantasy novel, that somebody gives me or asks me to blurb, and I get a sense, okay, they've just kind of established the rules, and then they break those rules. That's just I find it impossible to continue. I felt that way, and that happens with movies all the time because superhero movies are so big. But I find like when they drop their own sort of themes or their own rules. I saw the Superman movie recently, and I really like James Gunn, and I thought it was a lot of fun. But there's this whole big theme at the beginning of that movie about at what point, like, is Superman have a moral obligation not to go save someone when saving someone means violating international borders, means, interfering in a war, means kidnapping a world leader, means doing all these things that are treason for anybody else and potentially dangerous. And so it's a really interesting question because they're sort of establishing some kind of rules of this world for this new Superman, and then they just kind of give up on that later, and they go, "Oh, well, it
Do
doesn't
it
really
anyway.
he's just a good guy." Yeah, exactly. So that's the challenge of fantasy is you get to make the rules, but you have to follow them.
Yeah, it was interesting. I was talking about that with publishing my finale because at one point in the series, and like you, I don't write all the books and then publish them. I write a book and publish it, and write a book and publish it. So if you're right, if you decide that, oh wait, I can't do X, Y, Z because I already wrote the rule that I couldn't do X, Y, Z. So there were several things that I was like, dang, why did I make that rule? I have to work around that one. Um, yeah, so that can be a big challenge.
It absolutely is, and but I much prefer that process. I know that there are authors that will write a whole trilogy and then sort of release them afterwards, so that they're all kind of consistent. And if you think about on the film side, the Lord of the Rings trilogy was all filmed together for the most part, and then they were editing and releasing them as they went, and that worked amazingly well. But for me, well, I don't love it at the time. I always love it later, where you realize you've written yourself into this absolutely impossible corner, and now you have to figure out how you're going to get out from that. Um, and the nice thing, I think that often readers, one of the experiences that they don't get that authors get to have is the strange phenomenon and the kind of serendipitous kind of joy where you have written yourself into this corner, and it looks like there's no way out of it, and then suddenly something, and it's usually something to do with one of the themes that you've raised in your book. It's literally that theme that helps you find the one way out that then feels like this was inevitable all along, so that you can then spend the rest of your career when you're being interviewed about the end of a book going, oh yes, of course I knew it had to be
Oh
that
yeah, it
way.
made total sense. But yeah, I definitely had that in one of my books. Like the witches had branded them so they could only go so far, like physically go so far. And I was like, okay, I didn't create how the branding worked or how it,
Mhm.
if they could remove it or anything. I'm like, how is this guy going to get across the world when he can only go 100 miles? Like, what does it look like? And it took me like hours to be like, oh, I could do it this way and this way and this way. So, and that's the fun part of writing for me. I know a lot of authors are very meticulous with outlines and knowing exactly what they're going to write. If I had to do that, I would never write. I would be like, I know, like I'm maybe like you. I know the beginning, I know the end. I might know a little bit about the climax or what like spurs the person to action, but then I'm just like making it up in between. So, yeah.
No, exactly. Yeah, I always run, so I have written massive outlines for novels, 40, 50 page outlines, which for me is massive. Some people write longer
Yeah.
ones. And then I'll start writing the book, and it falls apart. And always falls apart, or the outline falls apart. The book ends up being much better, but the outline falls apart for the very same reason, which is I think if you're really committed to character, then unless you have thought of every single thing that character would do in every situation, your outline, which is fundamentally an expression of plot rather than character,
Yeah.
is going to come into conflict. And so, for example, I had a lot of stuff outlined for this book that I'm writing now. The series is called The Path of Swords, and it's the first book. And Caleb, who I love as a main character, is because he's this kid from basically from rural Kentucky who everybody always assumes he's in this sort of academy where of warrior diplomats basically where like they're all like the best of the best and the cream of the crop and stuff, and he's just spent so much of his life with people always looking down on him and assuming, well, he must be a redneck. Oh, you're from southern Kentucky, you must be some racist kid, you must be homophobic or whatever else, and they never like credit the fact that maybe he actually learned Latin and ancient Greek, and maybe he knows how to fence, and maybe he's actually studied some things. And so he always has this phrase that he tells people. He says, "Just because you're looking down on me doesn't mean you see who I am." And that type of character I love because he's so because there's a fundamental rebellion against everything that's going on. And so, but that means that as soon as I start writing the book, when I have a thing where okay, plot says this happens, Caleb does this. Caleb doesn't do that, right? That you realize because as you're writing it and as you're breathing life into that character, that character would not necessarily go the same route everyone else would go in that position. And so and that for me is something that's incredibly hard to predict ahead of time. Like especially, a character who acts out of any kind of rebellion or a character who's acting out of emotional trauma or any of those things. The whole point is that they're hard to predict what they do. That's what makes them so interesting to follow. And so I'll have these scenes where I'm like, okay, I know exactly where a typical book fantasy would go in this sort of situation. And I go, yeah, but Caleb's not going that way. He's going to go, screw you guys. I'm headed over here. So yeah, so that's part of, that's part of the joy of it. Like I have lots of friends who write exhaustive outlines and they follow that process almost religiously. And so there's a real satisfaction you can see as they're unfolding that and fixing changing things as they go and getting to the end. But for me, there nothing beats the whole, oh my God, how the hell do I get the characters out of this one? I'm in the last 10% of the book and then suddenly finding it.
Interesting. That sounds like so much fun. So you're working on Malevolent 9. What else is going on this year?
So a friend of mine, Christy Cherish, who's a noted urban fantasy author, she and I accidentally wrote a hard science fiction astronaut novel. It started out as a novella, and then we do these sort of writing experiments together periodically. We'll write a short story in an hour, and just like start from zero and have to get to a story in an hour together. And so we've written all these wonderful stories, and one of them sort of expanded into a novella. And then we ended up selling that on proposal as a full novel to Simon and Schuster, and so we've just delivered that book recently. So I've never worked with Simon and Schuster before, or the editor seems lovely. I have no idea what those notes are going to come back as. So that'll be kind of interesting to experience. And then, of course, Path of Swords, which is this progression fantasy. It's sort of young adult fantasy. And I've just delivered Our Lady of Blades, which is a novel I've spent. You remember earlier I was saying, I wrote the first draft of Malevolent Seven in a month, I think. I've spent 7 years on Our Lady of Blades. I think I'm at draft 28, because that's the problem. Like, people talk about pantsers and plotters, or plotters and pantsers, right? And I really, for me, fiction, it's you're more like a prospector. Like, you're just digging for gold, right? And if you find the gold right away, great. But you can spend 7 years digging for gold, and and that's what I've done with that book. So yeah, so the science, the astronaut novel, the Path of Swords, the first book there, Our Lady of Blades, and then Malevolent Nine, which is due at the end of this year. So it's been an incredibly busy year for me, and I'm just starting a cross Canada and some parts of the U.S. book tour for Malevolent Eight in a few weeks.
That's great. Well, congratulations. What a busy year and how exciting. And hopefully you will come back next year with like recovered a little bit and tell us more about those books. Where can everyone listening find you and your books?
The easiest place to find me is at my website, which is decastell.com. That's Decastell. Even if you spell it wrong, you'll probably find me anyway. I'm pretty easy to find. My books are available in all the usual places, the Barnes and Nobles, the Amazons, indie bookstores, and stuff like that. Some of them have been translated into 16 different languages around the world, and a couple of the series have been optioned for film and TV. So I've been very lucky, and so I'm usually pretty easy to find. And yeah, if you happen to be in any of the cities I'm going to be in, we'll be announcing the tour dates in the next week or two, on probably on the website and on social media. Then I'd love to meet everyone who wants to come by.
How fun. Yeah, and I saw on your website you have lots of short story bonuses there too.
Yeah, that's a weird trick that I figured out a while back that I don't think enough authors do, which is, I realized that when someone finishes one of your books or finishes a series, they often really want to stay in that world for a little while longer. That's the only reason they go to your website typically. They go, "Oh my God, I love this book. I want to hold on to this feeling." And so they'll go to an author website because it's a way of hanging on to that feeling a little bit. They'll see stuff about the book that they just read or whatever. And I found that often actually what people want isn't even to now, okay, I now want to start a whole new series, but often short stories either in that world, for example, or in your other worlds. They want to spend more time with the author, but they don't necessarily want to suddenly commit to an entire novel. And so I started publishing stories on my website, and just, if it's a short story, I sell it for 99 cents in ebook, or $1.99 on audio. And if it's I do them all professionally with, I get professional narrators and the whole bit. Um, and so people go, and yeah, I've been shocked at just how many people really like the ability to go, oh, cool, he wrote something here with this character. I want to read that story. And so I the only book I've ever self-published in my career is called Tales of the Greatcoats. And it's just a collection of short stories in the world of the Greatcoats, Traitor's Blade, and that series of books. And I've been blown away by how much that book sells around the world. Like, I've never marketed it, I've never done anything. Um, but I guess there's just, yeah, lots of people when they finish those other books, they go, "Oh, here's some stories I can read." Or people who've never read The Greatcoats end up picking it up, which is a really good argument for doing two things. This is sort of a little trick for authors out there. One is make your name gigantic on the cover. In trad publishing, they'll always make your name very tiny, because they think that you're not famous. But when it was Malevolent Seven and Malevolent Eight time, I was insistent, like, it's got to be this big, so it's this giant version of my name. And the second was, I had a very old school classic painting, like fantasy painting, done for the cover. Guy with sword standing in front of castle. Um, so it's just so much, so clear what it is, that people buy that collection of short stories who haven't even read my other books before, which is very strange because I never thought anybody bought short story collections or short stories. But just if you're an author out there and you need a break, or you're stuck on one of your books, write some really good short stories, edit them really well, give them really nice covers. Like, there's some good services out there that'll, give you a really professional looking cover for like $10 or something, and give your readers a chance to spend some time with you where they don't have to necessarily commit to the next, 400-page book.
Right. Yeah, that's amazing. So fun. Yeah, and I mean, definitely when I read a series that I love, I'm like, if I could just have a little bit more of this. So, I think that's wonderful.
It's also very freeing because especially for example like me, like with the Greatcoats and with Spellslinger and with Malevolent Seven, those series, they're all first person narrators, and so they're so committed in terms of being from the perspective of those main characters, that other characters, you'll have other characters where you don't get to explore them in as much detail. And one of the first stories I wrote was called Grave of Thorns. I had been writing the fourth Greatcoats book, and there's all the Greatcoats are these traveling magistrates. They, swashbuckling traveling magistrates, right? So they hear cases and they judge them and they enforce the laws. And at the end, Falcio has to deal with these sort of rebel Greatcoats who tried to kind of stage a takeover because they decided that a country run by judges would be better than one run by kings or politicians. And and he's so angry at these people who betrayed their oaths that he's very hard on them, which makes sense. Like that is exactly who he'd be. But there's one of the characters called Muriel de Vierre, who's was also called the King's Thorn, because they all have these names like the King's Sword or the King's Blade, the King's Arrow, the King's Heart, and she was the King's Thorn. And Falke is so hard on her, and I'm like, I can't give her the chance to respond because that's not where this story goes. And so the chance to go and write her story of what happens after that moment was actually really kind of therapeutic for me, I think, in a creative way. And also readers really like it because, you're not, rather than having to wreck the internal structure of your own novels by going, oh, I want that person's story being told inside this book where it doesn't make sense. You can kind of do it as this adjunct. And so then you get each book almost has these little satellites of short stories around it. So yeah, it's really fun. It's worth the effort, and readers seem to really love that.
Yeah, and it's a way for like I miss my characters, so it's a way for
Yeah,
authors to revisit those too.
totally. Yeah, absolutely. I wrote a whole short story that's just Falkio contending with the fact that he's about to become a father and he's convinced he's going to be terrible at it. And he's just so terrified that a life of violence, of sword fighting, is going to, means that the only thing he's good for is going to be protecting his daughter, and it's him coming to grips with that. And that's the kind of thing you don't have room to put it into the novel, but as a short story, people seem to really love it, and I love it too. So
Fun. Yeah, well, thank you so much for being here and spending so much time with us. This has been delightful and wonderful. So thank you for being here, and hopefully
thanks
we'll
so
have you
much.
back next year.
I'd love to. Thanks for having me, Trisha.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Finding the Magic podcast. I'm your host, author and podcaster Trisha Copeland, and I love getting behind the scenes. If you like the podcast, make sure to subscribe and stop in each week to discover new authors and books. Thanks for listening, and until next time, keep finding the magic.